Have you ever noticed how history sometimes changes before most people even realize it has happened? You go to bed thinking the world looks one way, then wake up to headlines suggesting that an invisible line, one that had held for decades, may have just disappeared. That is exactly why today's events have captured so much attention. Whether you follow global affairs every day or only glance at the news occasionally, this moment feels different. Not because one military operation automatically rewrites history, but because it raises a question governments around the world have been trying to avoid for years: what happens when two longtime rivals stop operating through shadows and begin confronting each other more directly. Reports indicate that Israel carried out a large-scale military operation against targets inside Iran, focusing on facilities believed to have strategic military importance. While officials from multiple governments continue to release limited information, analysts broadly agree on one point: this was not simply another exchange involving proxy forces somewhere else in the region. Instead, it appears to represent a far more direct phase in an already complicated confrontation that has been building for decades. Understanding why this matters requires looking beyond the operation itself. For years, Israel and Iran have competed through intelligence operations, regional proxy groups, and covert military activities. Rarely did either side openly acknowledge the full extent of that competition. Each action was designed to impose costs while stopping short of creating a conflict that neither government could easily control. That careful balance, fragile as it always was, helped prevent the rivalry from becoming a sustained direct military confrontation. But every long-running strategic competition carries a hidden risk. The more pressure builds over time, the harder it becomes to maintain restraint. Military planners often describe this as an escalation ladder. Every step upward reduces the available space for diplomacy, while increasing pressure on political leaders to demonstrate strength. Once that process begins, every decision becomes more consequential than the one before. Israeli officials have long argued that preventing Iran from expanding advanced missile capabilities and nuclear-related infrastructure represents a core national security objective. Iranian leaders, meanwhile, have consistently framed Israeli military activities as evidence of a broader campaign aimed at weakening Iran's regional influence. Whether one agrees with either position or not, both governments have spent years preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. That preparation includes intelligence gathering, logistical planning, missile defense development, cyber capabilities, and military exercises designed specifically for moments when tensions suddenly accelerate. One reason military analysts are paying such close attention is that operations of this scale rarely emerge overnight. Large precision strikes require months, and sometimes years, of preparation. Intelligence must identify targets, logistics must position equipment, communications must remain secure, and planners must consider countless possible responses before a single aircraft ever leaves the ground. Modern warfare is often decided long before the first missile is launched, through planning, logistics, surveillance, and coordination rather than battlefield improvisation. This is also why governments around the world reacted so quickly. Within hours, diplomatic channels reportedly became unusually active. Emergency consultations began across multiple capitals. Not necessarily because every country expected an immediate regional war, but because every government understood that uncertainty itself can become dangerous. Markets dislike uncertainty. Military alliances dislike uncertainty. Civil aviation, energy companies, and international shipping networks all begin adjusting their calculations whenever the possibility of wider instability appears. Russia responded by criticizing the reported strikes and calling for international discussions on regional stability. China expressed concern as well, emphasizing restraint and warning against further escalation. While those statements may sound familiar to anyone who follows international politics, they also reflect something deeper. Neither Moscow nor Beijing views Iran simply as another country in the Middle East. Both maintain significant strategic and economic relationships with Tehran, though for different reasons. Russia values military cooperation and regional influence, while China has invested heavily in long-term trade and infrastructure connections throughout the region. From their perspective, instability inside Iran affects much more than regional politics. It influences energy markets, transportation corridors, investment projects, and the broader balance of power between major global players. This is why reactions from Moscow and Beijing deserve careful attention, not necessarily because they determine what happens next, but because they reveal how interconnected today's geopolitical landscape has become. Washington's response has also been closely watched. Public statements have generally emphasized Israel's security concerns while encouraging efforts to avoid broader escalation. That balancing act reflects one of the central challenges facing American policymakers. On one hand, the United States maintains a long-standing security partnership with Israel. On the other, It also has strong incentives to prevent a conflict that could expand across multiple countries, disrupt global energy supplies, and require far greater military involvement than anyone currently wants. Perhaps the most important point, however, is that military operations rarely exist in isolation. Every action generates political consequences, economic consequences, diplomatic consequences, and strategic consequences that continue unfolding long after headlines move on. Satellite images may reveal physical damage within days, but shifts in alliances, deterrence, military planning, and regional perceptions often take months or even years to fully emerge. History repeatedly shows that the first strike is rarely the final chapter. Instead, it often becomes the beginning of a much longer strategic story. But military operations never unfold in a vacuum. Even before the immediate consequences become clear, governments begin asking a much larger question: what comes next? That question matters far more than the operation itself, because history has repeatedly shown that the first move in a crisis rarely determines the final outcome. Instead, it is the sequence of decisions that follows the restraint shown, the signals interpreted correctly or incorrectly, and the willingness of leaders to step back from escalation that ultimately shapes the future. For Iran, the strategic calculation is extraordinarily complicated. Any government facing a direct strike on its territory must consider how to respond without creating consequences it cannot control. A response viewed as too limited could be interpreted domestically as weakness. A response viewed as too broad could dramatically increase the risk of a wider regional conflict. Military planners sometimes describe this as the deterrence dilemma. Every action intended to demonstrate strength also creates new risks that may outweigh its intended benefits. That uncertainty is exactly why intelligence agencies across the world are working around the clock. Their primary objective is not simply determining what has already happened, but identifying indicators of what could happen next. Are additional military units being repositioned? Are missile forces changing readiness levels? Are naval deployments increasing? Are proxy organizations receiving new instructions? These questions often provide more insight into the future than today's headlines ever can. Another critical factor involves regional partners and non-state actors. The Middle East is one of the world's most interconnected security environments. Decisions made in one capital can influence calculations hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Groups aligned with different governments may interpret events differently, creating additional uncertainty even if national leaders themselves prefer restraint. That is why military analysts rarely examine a single country's actions in isolation. Instead, they evaluate the entire regional network of alliances, partnerships, rivalries, logistics, and strategic interests. This is also where economics begins to intersect with security. Modern conflicts are no longer measured only by military capability. Energy markets, shipping insurance, supply chains, financial confidence, and investment decisions all react almost immediately whenever instability appears near critical trade routes. Even if no additional military action occurs, uncertainty alone can influence commodity prices, transportation costs, and business planning around the world. Few regions illustrate this more clearly than the Persian Gulf. A significant share of global energy exports passes through waterways that have long been considered strategically sensitive. Whenever tensions rise, markets begin evaluating not only current production but also the possibility of future disruption. Investors dislike uncertainty almost as much as they dislike actual conflict, which explains why financial reactions often occur long before military outcomes become clear. This is one reason geopolitical crises rarely remain regional stories. A decision made in the Middle East may influence manufacturing costs in Europe, transportation expenses in North America, or consumer prices in Asia. In today's interconnected economy, geography matters less than supply chains. A disruption affecting one strategic corridor can eventually reach households thousands of miles away through higher shipping costs, inflation, or slower economic growth. Diplomatically, the coming days may prove just as important as the military developments themselves. International organizations will almost certainly continue holding emergency consultations. Behind closed doors, governments that rarely appear together publicly may be exchanging messages designed to reduce misunderstandings and prevent further escalation. History suggests that some of the most important diplomatic conversations during international crises never appear in official press releases. Quiet communication often becomes just as valuable as public statements. At the same time, information itself becomes another battlefield. Modern conflicts unfold not only through military operations but also through competing narratives. Governments attempt to shape international opinion, justify their actions, reassure domestic audiences, and influence future diplomatic negotiations. That is why early reports during rapidly developing situations should always be approached carefully. Initial information is often incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and occasionally incorrect. Responsible analysis requires distinguishing between confirmed facts, official statements, independent assessments, and speculation. This is especially important because public perception increasingly influences strategic decision-making. Leaders understand that international support or criticism can affect diplomatic flexibility, economic partnerships, and future security cooperation. Winning the information environment has become nearly as important as achieving military objectives on the ground. Looking further ahead, analysts generally describe three broad possibilities. The reality often falls somewhere between them. The first possibility is controlled D-escalation. Under this scenario, both governments eventually conclude that they have demonstrated sufficient resolve and gradually reduce military activity while continuing indirect competition through diplomatic and economic pressure. This would not eliminate tensions, but it could prevent the crisis from expanding into a broader regional confrontation. The second possibility involves a prolonged cycle of limited retaliation. Rather than one decisive escalation, both sides could continue responding to one another through carefully calibrated military, cyber, intelligence, or proxy operations. History offers numerous examples of rival states remaining locked in this type of competition for years without crossing into full-scale war. The third and most concerning possibility is miscalculation. Throughout history, many major conflicts have not begun because leaders deliberately sought a large war, but because each side underestimated how the other would respond. A single intelligence failure, communication breakdown, or unintended consequence can sometimes accelerate events far beyond what policymakers originally intended. Strategic history repeatedly reminds us that wars often expand through cumulative decisions rather than one dramatic moment. For that reason, perhaps the most important developments to watch over the coming weeks will not necessarily involve military hardware. Instead, attention should focus on diplomatic engagement, regional messaging, alliance coordination, economic indicators, and efforts to establish channels that reduce the risk of misunderstanding. Those quieter developments rarely dominate headlines, yet they often determine whether a crisis stabilizes or continues escalating. As observers, it is also worth remembering something that can easily be overlooked amid discussions of missiles, air defenses, and geopolitical strategy. Behind every policy decision, ordinary people whose daily lives are shaped by events entirely outside their control, families concerned about security, businesses facing uncertainty, humanitarian organizations preparing contingency plans, and communities hoping that political leaders choose restraint over escalation all become part of the story, even though they rarely appear in strategic briefings. Ultimately, this moment represents more than a single military operation. It reflects the increasingly complex world that has emerged over the past decade, a world where regional rivalries overlap with global competition, where economics and security are inseparable, and where decisions made in one region can quickly influence international stability. No one can honestly say today exactly how this story will end. What can be said is that another important chapter has begun. Governments will continue reassessing their strategies. Militaries will continue evaluating risks. Diplomats will continue searching for opportunities to reduce tensions. And the international community will continue watching closely. Because the choices made in the coming days may influence regional security for years to come. History rarely changes in a single day. More often, it changes through a series of decisions that seem manageable individually but become transformative when viewed together. Whether this moment becomes another episode in a long-running rivalry or the beginning of a more significant geopolitical shift will depend not only on military capability, but also on political judgment, diplomatic restraint, and the ability of leaders to recognize where escalation ends and long-term stability begins. That is the question the world is now waiting to have answered.